This is the first week of the course, and the lectures are mostly about how gender and sex are different, why it's important to study gender, and what the feminist movement was and is all about. I'm not going to get too much into the material here as the lectures cover it nicely, but one thing I really want to highlight is the difference between sex and gender and why this matters. Certainly, times are changing and people are becoming more tolerant and more accepting of people who are different. Basically, anyone who doesn't fit society's idea of a normal man or a normal woman. But there are still a lot of people who think that transgender issues aren't important. That in fact there's no such thing as transgender, or it's just a mental illness, or that society is being ridiculous by supporting transgender people in transitioning or encouraging them to undergo hormone treatments or sexual reassignment surgeries. But hopefully after taking this course, you'll be able to refute those ideas, to point out that it's in fact ridiculous to insist that sex and gender are exactly the same thing, and that it's not just some new-fashioned cool idea that gender is a social construction. And hopefully after taking this course, you'll be more tolerant of differences. That person you see walking down the street where you can't quite tell whether they're a man or a woman, maybe that used to bother you before. Or maybe it just made you uncomfortable because you didn't understand why they weren't obviously presenting as either a male or a female. And maybe it will still make you uncomfortable, but at least you know where your feelings are coming from and you can work on changing that. It's hard to shift how you view gender if it's just been very black and white, so to speak, if you've never really thought about how gender is understood or constructed in our society, or why we have such different stereotypes and expectations of men and women, or what the consequences are for treating girls and boys and men and women so differently are, then this course might be a bit of a shock, and it might feel pretty challenging at times. It's not comfortable to think that our parents or grandparents or caregivers may have behaved in ways that reinforce damaging gender stereotypes and roles by teaching us that boys don't cry or girls have to look pretty. So be prepared at times to feel uncomfortable, either because you realize that your own or others' attitudes and behaviors may not be that ideal. But once we know better, we can do better. Week 2, Chapter 2. This week, we'll be talking about research, how research is done in psychology, and how research can be biased with regards to gender. Some of you may have already taken a course in research methods, and the first lecture will largely be a review, but this may be brand new material for others. The fact that research is done is often taken for granted. Well, of course, people would do research to find out that answer to that question, but the average person likely isn't aware of all that has to happen in order to get to the point where you can actually do the research. Any research involving people or animals has to be approved by a committee to make sure that it's ethical, that it won't hurt the participants who are involved. And the researcher has to have a pretty good reason for why that research is important. Unfortunately, after taking the time to design and carry out an effective and ethical study in order to answer a particular important question, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the media twists the story to make it more interesting and a little less accurate. This often happens with research on gender because everyone wants to hear how and why men and women are different, because it fits with our cultural views of men are from Mars and women are from Venus. So it's important for you to start questioning the research that you're reading about. Maybe someone posts a link on Facebook to a Psychology Today blog post about a recent study that found gender differences on a cognitive task. Who's the author of that blog? What are their credentials? Are they talking about published research or something that hasn't yet been accepted for publication? The latter means that it hasn't been peer-reviewed by others in the field. Can you find the actual article? Who wrote that article? Does it seem well thought out, well written? Does the research make sense? What conclusions did the original researcher make? Are these the same conclusions that the blog author is making? Does the blog author or the original researcher seem to have an agenda? Do they seem biased for or against a particular gender? There are a lot of questions that you need to ask when you're reading about research to make sure that you're getting the right story, not just the story that the blog author or journalist or whoever is trying to tell you. And it can be confusing and it can sometimes seem like everyone is biased, but most researchers are doing their best to be as objective and unbiased as possible. But it's always worth looking at everything with a critical eye. Week 3, Chapter 3. We have stereotypes about everything and everyone. That's just how our brains work. We like shortcuts and efficiency, but sometimes that means we overlook important information. This isn't just the case with gender stereotypes. This is true whether we're discussing stereotypes about race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, disability, and so on. But obviously in this class, our focus is on stereotypes about gender. And we have lots of them. And they're hard to get away from. We see stereotypes about gender in the media all the time. How many sitcoms or romantic comedy movies are almost entirely based on gender stereotypes? So many of the books we read,